Welcome, everyone. My name is Alia Jafar. I am the Director of International Relations at the Islamic Chamber of Commerce. I'm extremely excited to be part of the ICCIA Leadership Talks. The idea is to bring together the leading voices from all the areas that impact the private sector of the OIC countries. The global COVID pandemic has forever changed our experiences as customers, as employees, as citizens, as well as human beings. And as a result, our behavior as well as our attitudes are changing. The crisis has fundamentally transformed how, what, and where we consume, from the way we shop, the education, entertainment, and like I said, even if our fitness routine has all gone online. And it has set in motion structural changes for all businesses as well as, as well as the social fabric of our society. As the immediate threat of the virus subsides, companies and organizations will need to consider the impact of the changes and look at the way we design, communicate, build, and run the experiences that people need and want. In this new world, we all need clarity and a measured way forward. Plans need to be fit for purpose today, but capable of evolving as the global health and economic environment changes. Businesses, governments, citizens, and nonprofits all play critical role in establishing a human-centered, systems-minded, and agile approaches that promote shared workforce resilience. And this is not a one-time process. It will require the development of persistent capabilities and relationships across stakeholder groups. Addressing these needs for our member countries, the Islamic Chamber of Commerce, Industries and Agriculture is pleased to announce the ICCIA Leadership Talks, an online platform where our members, as well as concerned stakeholders, are able to network, communicate, share, and learn from global experts, business leaders, professionals, and most importantly, each other. In this series, we will discuss topics ranging from innovative business strategies across all functions to employee well-being, as well as the expectations from the governments and other international organizations, and also share what the private sector is doing to contribute to the recovery from this pandemic. It's also a place for people to have open dialogue, hearing sounds from the private sector of the Islamic world and the world at large to produce contextualized information on ongoing shifting trends, arising opportunities, as well as challenges. Our first theme is moving to the virtual world. It has been broken down into 4 segments. Today is the first, where we will explore and define the virtual world. This will be followed up by webinars on opportunities, challenges, and best practices in times of COVID-19. So let's begin with an introduction of our distinguished speakers who are joining us from Bangkok and Pakistan. Our first speaker, Mr. David Gallipo, founder SDGX, a deep technology research lab, a corporate venture builder, and investment fund management firm. Director of the Yunus Near Future Lab, lecturer at the United Nations Staff College. He founded the United Nations Social Innovation and Entrepreneurship Programs, as well as the United Nations Social Impact Finance Initiative. He has lived and worked for the last 35 years in Europe and Asia, and more recently, Thailand and Singapore. Our second speaker for today, Mr. Javed Iqbal, is the CEO of TransformX, a global consultancy focusing on advisory and education in digital transformation, customer experience, technology disruption, and innovation space. Javed has spent over 2 decades in large-scale complex business and technology transformation solutions for global Fortune 500 companies, as well as governments across North America, Europe, and Asia. He has held leadership roles at Salesforce, EY, and PwC, and speaks globally on trends of the future. He is a certified board director and an advisor to multiple technology startups and ecosystems across Asian and Middle Eastern countries. And with that, let's start with our first question. Welcome, Javed and David. So, David, my first question is for you. What is the virtual world post-pandemic, and how does it affect, in your view, the overall future of ICCIA member countries? On to you.
Thanks very much, Alia. And welcome to everyone who's coming on and who's registered, who's in the webinar right now. I'm going to share my screen, and that should be shared. Let me know if you can actually see my screen. I believe so. Let me start just to give a bit of a background, because what we're really talking about is it's a huge question, and we've got some really interesting things to discuss over the course of the next hour and a bit. But just to give a bit of a background, I'm Canadian. Did my undergrad in Canada. Started my work experience in Canada, but very quickly I ended up in Europe, and I spent about 20 years in Europe, mostly in corporate finance, M&A, business development. And then I sort of went back, completed my graduate and postgraduate education in the United States, got onto technology extremely early, before the internet, was part of the dot-com era that really came in 95 to 2000 era with a lot of the internet startups. And after that, I joined the United Nations in Switzerland, in Geneva. And for the last 10 years, I've been with the United Nations out here in Bangkok at their regional center, really looking at the whole of Asia Pacific. And I left the United Nations at the end of June last year and created SDGX. As Aaliyah mentioned, it's just this company that we really we focus on deep technology, and we really look on venture capital, on building ventures and scale-ups, and on the research side. So that's a bit of a diatribe about me, but it's not really about me. What it really represents is I'm a bit of an accidental hybrid. I sort of started in one country, went to other countries, ended up now in Asia. I went from one sector to other sectors. I've got exposure to the development sector, civic sector, academia, and worked a lot with the public sector, with governments. And that's all basically an accident. So I'm sort of this accidental hybrid, which for me actually is quite advantageous, because we are moving very much into a hybrid economy. And in this hybrid economy, when we talk about digital transformation, the roles of the public sector, the private sector, the civic sector are going to start shifting. Consumer behavior is changing rapidly, especially after the pandemic, COVID-19. We're seeing a lot of change. We also see the economics, the financial systems really starting to think about impact investing, sustainable capitalism, green economy, circular economy. So there's a huge amount of change that's going on in the world right now. And the question is, whether you're an investor, whether you're a business owner, whether you're a policymaker, whether you're a student, a founder, an entrepreneur, it really is to try to understand where we are. Javed and I, we're going to walk through some of the scenarios of where we are right now to better inform you on what sort of pathway you want to choose, what sort of decisions you want to make going forward. So when we see this question, the post-pandemic world, how will it accelerate digital transformation, specifically in ICCIA member countries? What the pandemic is really doing is accelerating that digital transformation. Now we see a lot of work from home, virtual work happening. We're seeing online students, virtual education happening. We're seeing e-commerce now picking up. So we're seeing whole virtual commerce starting to happen, even touching on relationships and how we sort of gather and learn things. There's a lot of virtuality that's really coming into things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through some of the challenges and talk about some of the technologies. And then I'm going to present 3 different scenarios on where this sort of impacts and how the future is going to look, depending on which pathways, which government context, which policy brings in, what the commercial world decides to do, and how quickly some of these advanced technologies like artificial intelligence, automation, robotics, how quickly that gets adapted into the business cycle. So let me start with this. I mean, policy innovation, cross-sector partnership, this is going to be the key to digital transformation. This is fundamental because we can't see industry doing this alone. We can't see government doing this alone. We can't see civic society or citizens doing this alone. So there's going to be a lot of cross-sector partnerships that's going to happen. We're going to have to break out of our silos, and we're going to have to sort of reach across the aisleways to work with a lot of partners that normally we don't work with. And I think this is going to be important. As I mentioned before, COVID-19 has really caused radical and visible changes to consumer behavior. We're seeing a lot of this consumer behavior now as they're sort of forced to stay at home, order online, work online, learn online. We're seeing a rapid advancement on how the citizen is really sort of adapting to the digital transformation. And the third point, governments must adapt to the increased role of new data sources, advanced analytics. It's not necessarily data itself. There's a lot of data. There's new sources of data. We see data coming up, social media data, all sorts of data coming up. But the role of data, this is going to be very important. And governments, policymakers have to understand what is that role of data. How are they going to analyze that data? Because that data gives you insights into citizen behavior, into demands, requirements, public services, public goods. This becomes very important because this is what private sector has been doing for years. They've really started to analyze their data to understand how their business is being run, how the supply chains are creating efficiencies, how the consumers are buying and buying habits. So now government's going to have to pick up this role. So there's a real emphasis on policymakers, decision makers, and those that influence decision makers to really start to understand how data sort of fits in. When we start to look at the way that the population bubbles and the demographics are happening, and this is basically true, the first person to live until 150 years old is already born. If I get lucky, if I play my cards right, maybe I'll get to 2040, 2050, 2060, but a lot of you younger people and a lot of your children will be alive in the year 2100. And that sort of creates the atmosphere where decisions that we make today are going to have a much more lasting impact on future generations. The growth, the Muslims' fastest growth community, 73%, but interesting enough, the largest youth population. This is an incredible opportunity. When we start to look at some of the, especially in the developed world, the aging population, Japan, Europe, some of the aging populations, that's going to create a lot of stress on government finance, a lot of stress on societies. But having a large youth bubble, this is a really interesting opportunity. And without education reform, the digital transformation, basically you're going to have generational de-skilling. So we do need education reform. A lot of students entering or coming out of high school, entering into their universities, coming out of their masters, they're not getting the skills and the learning that they need to survive with all this transformation that's going to be happening. So education reform is really, really important. And that cuts across investors who are investing in education or educational technology. It cuts across policymakers who are making policy around education, loosening up the hands of education. And it also puts a lot of pressure on students on what they really need to learn. So this brings into a lot of concepts around the impact. Food 4.0. Agriculture is changing dramatically. Not only industrialization on one side, but we're also seeing the opportunity for value-added production, the opportunity for supply chain efficiencies and logistics efficiencies with some of the new technologies. This needs new skills. So new skills are going to be required to sort of reshape the value chain and the processes in the agriculture sector. This is really important because food is one of the basics behind water and security. It's one of the bases of development, especially rural economic development. Growers, labor-intensive food processing centers, they're having labor shortages at the moment. This is putting a lot of pressure towards automation. bringing in robotics, bringing in artificial intelligence, drones, data analytics. So a lot in the agriculture, when you look at the supply chains, logistics chains, and some of the value chains, there's going to be a lot of pressure to automate. And again, on one side, it does need new skills, but on the other side, it will put pressure on labor. Post-pandemic increase in health-related biotech. All this emphasis now, because of COVID-19, there's a lot of money now being put towards, a lot of policy being incentivized around health-related biotech. That's going to be a great opportunity for agriculture technology because it goes hand in hand. So if there's a way that we can sort of look to the biotech or agriculture biotech industries and see how that now can have impacts on increasing production, increasing quality and quality control, bringing efficiencies into supply chains, reducing the complexity of supply chains, getting a product from a farm to a table. So there's a lot of potential here as well. The world is literally choking in pollution. I mean, we see this around, you look around, this is a big problem. So we have climate change on one side, but the pollution problem. So, and in the second point, the Muslim world is mainly located in latitudes which are particularly vulnerable to the climate change around the equator, particularly vulnerable around climate change. So there's a lot of opportunity when we look at climate technology. There's a lot of opportunity when we look at decarbonization. And again, this is going to be accelerated because of the digital transformation as some of this new technology starts to be brought in. A lot of this new technology can help. This is one of the areas where a lot of the technology is being targeted towards climate change, pollution, decarbonization, and with proper policy incentives to open up maybe some restrictions when we look at the traditional energy sources going into alternative energy sources. These are a lot of great opportunities. And lately I've been reading about this eco-theology, sort of looking at communities and regional communities on how that can be brought into really the mind shifts to sort of unite the communities against climate change. And we've seen some of this in Europe, a huge opportunity in the Muslim community as well, to really see now how do we change that mindset towards really looking at climate change and how do we sort of avoid some of the mistakes that were made in the past around climate change and how do we really work towards a sort of a global initiative going forward. Urbanization, we hear about it all the time. There's a mass push towards urbanization. A lot of people are moving to the cities. Rural economic development, as much as it used to be very labor intensive, but as agriculture becomes more automated, a lot of that labor now is going to move into the cities. A lot of urban design is being influenced now by climate change. Digital technologies, dynamic innovation ecosystems. We're looking at climate resistant materials. How do we sort of build in a different way that is much more open and much more collegial to citizens? How do we work? How do we take the human element and bring it into this concept of smart cities? Smart cities have more or less failed over the last 10, 15 years because of the focus on technology, not the focus on the citizen. So how do we sort of bring this around? Inclusive infrastructure development sort of takes this combined effort of government and private sector. The new concepts of PPP or sustainable PPP, public-private partnerships. How do we sort of bring that in and include it? And the last point here is probably one of the more important points in this whole presentation. The hunt for talent is on. If your city or if your region or if your nation cannot attract talent, that is going to be very difficult. So there is a huge attraction or a huge hunt to bring talent into the urban areas or into the nations. We see this in the startup world. We see this in the scale-up world. So most of the entrepreneurs are really quite flexible on where they can sort of move their businesses. And this is really interesting when you look at Malaysia, for example, Indonesia. Malaysia is drawing a lot of talent into through government incentives, bringing founders and entrepreneurs to Malaysia. So there's a lot of great ways we do this, but talent is going to be one of the key development issues going forward. When we sort of sum up and we look at the state of affairs at the moment, You've got Ray Kurzweil, who is the founder or the co-founder of Singularity University. He's held the executive position at Google. He's the head of their engineering at Google. He's an inventor. He's an innovator. And he says artificial intelligence will dominate human intelligence by 2029. That is most likely true. With the advances in artificial intelligence and all the variants around artificial intelligence, that is most likely true. But at the same time, Klaus Schwab, who was the founder of the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab is saying that by 2030, human values are going to be tested to the breaking point. And it's no real coincidence when they're talking about that 2030 timeframe, because the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, are timed out until 2030. So 2030 now becomes the next pivot date to try to sort of see how the world will survive and how the world will adopt and adapt after 2030. But interestingly enough, the author out of the UK, Shalini Mohammed, Generation M, the new generation of Muslim youth, engaged, aspirational, entrepreneurial, proudly Muslim. This is an interesting now when you start to look at how the community can come together, but it also highlights the importance of youth, the importance of education, the importance of the mind shift. How do we sort of separate or at least coexist with the traditional? How do we take the traditional and the modern, put them together as we work into this digital transformation? A lot of the traditional knowledge is very valuable, even as we move forward into digital transformation. Traditional indigenous knowledge is very valuable. So it's not that we throw it out and we sort of take on all this modernity. We don't take on this all new stuff. It will, to survive, and I think for nations to survive in the future, you do have to take the mix of tradition and modern and see how that can adapt. How do you take that brand new knowledge and that old wisdom and bring it together? So what I want to run through now is 3 scenarios. So based on the 3, on a lot of this new technology come down the pipeline, we see the shift towards sustainable capitalism. We see green finance. We see a lot of the companies now starting to prioritize ESG, environmental, social, and governance sort of principles in their business on one side. We're seeing the consumers starting to shift. They're starting to demand more friendly products, environmentally friendly, socially friendly products and services. So we're seeing all the shift, and we're also seeing the governments bringing out policies around social innovation, social entrepreneurship. So when we start to look at the scenarios, let's go from bad to good, I guess. But the divergent world scenario. So imagine a world where the nations are becoming increasingly isolated, leading toward this multipolar economics, trade, politics, a lot of the countries just simply not getting along. The agriculture, infrastructure industries are dominated by domestic champions because there is sort of restrictions on trade, restriction on transfer of knowledge, transfer of technologies. So you get these domestic champions, but because there are these restrictions, they're slow to innovate, slow to adapt to these big external shifts, such as climate change. And when we start to look at the geopolitical context, it really is, and you'll get copies of this presentation, so I won't read it word for word, but clearly you can see that it's going to start the creation of these sort of regional cultural trade blocs, which is not necessarily bad on one side, but because there is a slowing of the transfer of knowledge, a slowing of the transfer of technology or innovation, it will slow the pace down. So when we have these major issues like climate change or other major issues like pandemics, nations or the world is actually collectively very slow to act. So we look at the pace of climate change, rapid. Because of the lack of technology, because of the lack of global coherence on how you actually approach things like climate change. Climate change is not national, it's a global phenomenon. Same thing with COVID-19 or potentially other pandemics or health issues coming in the future. These are all global in nature. So we're going to see sort of rapid impacts, and it's not going to be positive impacts. So there's going to be sort of a decollection, a disaggregation of effort, putting things forward. Technology progress, incremental. That makes sense, right? So as you start to, if everyone starts to become nationalists and starts to protect behind their own borders, they're not sharing ideas, they're not sharing technology, they're not sharing innovation, and they're not sharing really a sort of a collective movement around how do we get these new types of technology to create positive impacts and positive economic impacts, not only social impacts as well. So in this scenario, which sort of sounds like where we are today, but in this scenario, it's not the best scenario as we're going forward. But let's look at this digital world scenario. Imagine a world transformed by technology. Every facet of life is advanced by data analytics, intelligence, automation. Technology innovation is rampant. Incentivized progressive education investments on one side and policy on the other side. The results is innovative companies sort of reshaping their industries. So again, if we look at the geopolitical context, this is really a multilateral sort of world. And it's not a multilateral world that is only one-sided. This sort of is a West-East inclusion, North-South inclusion. So this is sort of a global multilateralism. Broad-based geopolitical cooperation sort of deepens all these sort of connections, open borders for trade, for ideas, for innovation, open borders for financing to go across. And there we see the infrastructure and agriculture industries really are led by the private sector, because that's where the innovation is sort of happening. Policy can be there to incentivize innovation, technology transfer, financing, open borders on financing. But it's not really the government's role to do that. It really is the role of the private sector, because that's where they're making the big R&D investments. So this is actually, so the government sort of takes a light touch approach. When you look at the pace of climate change, it's managed because of the collective efforts around climate adaptation, climate mitigation. There really is a global cooperation. And we see the advances of technology and policy really starting to put a dent in sort of this climate change and some of the other impacts, the global things that are affecting us. And technology progress obviously is disruptive. When you have so many ideas happening and so many free flow of finance and free flow of talent back and forth, you're going to see a lot of the disruption, but it's going to be managed disruption. It's going to be positive disruption because of this multilateral sort of approach, this cooperative sort of approach. And you're going to see nations learning from nations, learning from nations, learning from nations. And we're going to see this ripple effect of positive technology impacts happening out throughout the world. So this is sort of the brighter side of the digital transformation. And the last scenario I really want to talk about is really around this green world scenario. So imagine a world where the environment, well-being of citizens is the priority, paramount to economic, social, and political decision-making. Agricultural infrastructure industries are really revolutionized by following the ESG principles, so environment, social, and governance principles that are global in nature, really focused on innovation, mobility, circular economy principles. So really the reduction of pollution, the management of climate adaptation, a lot of financing going into green infrastructure, green industries, green products, green services, supply chain efficiencies, logistic efficiencies. So we get a lot of mobility efficiencies. And the context again here is multilateral. So again, comprehensive cooperation. But it really is around the alignment of public goods, because the climate change or the green world scenario is really a global world scenario. It really is around public goods. So that's where the focus really comes down to the public goods, really to benefit all citizens. And so we look at income equality. We look at the systems of economic finance and social integration. This is now where it has that impact as well, because you are not taking really a nationalistic view on the way your economy is being run. You're taking more of a holistic or a global view on the way the world is being run. Pace of change, again, is managed because of the global cooperation. And you see a lot of this prioritization around the greenest technologies being brought out and prioritized. Again, the focus again being on citizens. And then technology progress, you get this rapid adoption because of the nature of not national economies, but of the nature of the green world scenario. So of climate change, for example, or the circular economy. It really touches all sectors. It moves well beyond borders. So you're going to see this rapid adoption, not so much as disruption, because nations are not necessarily competing with each other in this world. In this world, they're working together towards this green revolution, the Green New Deal, if you will. So you can see rapid adoption. You can see nations helping other nations really to sort of manage a lot of these policy-driven but consumer-demanded sort of changes that are not only economic in nature, they're social in nature as well, and governance in nature as well. So that sort of lays out three generalized scenarios where you can sort of picture yourself if you're an investor, if you're a decision maker, if you're a student, if you're an entrepreneur, or if you're one of the corporates working for one of the large multinational organizations. This is sort of intent to see, this is the potential that we have. We have the potential of moving into a very sort of counter-revolution of politics toward nationalism, towards all the nations sort of protect themselves, or we have this opportunity to work into sort of a collaborative environment, where there's a green world environment, which is really putting citizens and nature first, or if it really is around the digital transformation, putting technology first. So you can see now, how do you position yourself? What decisions do you have to make? What do you need to learn when you start to look forward in that? And I believe this is my last slide. Lots of changes coming, lots of opportunities. So it really is now, how do you see yourself in this, this sort of transition? And how does that impact you, your community, your family, your company, your team? How does that impact everyone around? And what can you do then to really sort of start and figure out the pathway that you want to go down and sort of help others sort of engage and create that enabling environment for their pathways to also. And again, I'll just bring up the last point, the focus on talent and youth is really, really important. And thank you very much. There'll be a lot of time for questions afterwards, so I'll hand back to Alia right now. Thanks.
Thank you, David. That was really, really informative. I particularly like three scenarios that you've shared, and the one that I that's sticking with me is the green world scenario, particularly because from an Islamic perspective, the Islamic principles are very similar to the ESG. So from, being able to create profit, but keeping in mind the environment as well as the people and the benefit of all around you is kind of very close to what the Islamic world believes in. Okay, so we're going to have more discussion on that during the Q&A, like you said. I'd like to remind the participants at this time that if you have any questions, please feel free to share with us, that we will come back to after the presentations are done. Okay, so Javed, you are from one of the Islamic membership countries, and you've also had sort of experience in working with international as well as some of the countries within the members. So in your opinion, which industries within the ICCIA currently are the ripest for digital and virtual disruption, and what do these disruptions look like? Over to you.
Well, thank you for inviting me, first of all, Alia. Insightful presentation, David. I think the way you've sort of broken it down into those three scenarios, I think it speaks to the world as well. So disruption is very interesting. It's very regional as well. I've seen that, and I've experienced that over the last 20 years, working with governments and multiple corporations across the three different continents. And what I've come to realize is there's a humanistic aspect to this disruption, the way humans are starting to sort of evolve, and the multi-generations of the Generation X, and then the latest one, Generation Alpha, which I'll talk about in a second. And then how industries are evolving, and what would constitute an industry or a sector even going forward. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well, and then we'll talk about how the various countries in the Islamic Chamber, how are they ready, which ones are doing better, and so forth. So the first part, let's talk about the humanistic aspect as well. So Generation Alpha is humans that are born between 2010 and 2025. Now, this is the first generation that's born into the world of intelligence. Now, if you look at the parameters of the World Economic Forum and how they sort of distinguish the different industrial revolutions, the Economic Forum talks about how we're in the fourth industrial revolution right now. First one being more steams and engines, the second one more industrialization, third more to do with information technology, and then fourth is a confluence of all of them together, not only of machines, but even human body. So the way things are going to evolve from now on are going to be exponential. And the way this generation is evolving, because they're the first one to interact with machines in a way no one else has, it's changing the way we as policymakers, we as technologists, we as business people, we as venture capitalists, have to really start thinking about the decision making that David alluded to as well, on what humans are going to evolve to and what are they going to need from the governments, from the corporations around them as well. I'll give you an example. Back in my Salesforce days, I was at an executive briefing center in San Francisco, and over a break, I was pouring coffee, and one of my colleagues said to me, he said, "Javed, you won't believe what one of my 6-year-old daughter, Sarah, did yesterday." I said, "Well, okay, what did she do?" And he said, "Well, it was a Sunday morning. I was just doing some work in my basement, getting ready for the week ahead. And she came and she sat quietly for about 30 seconds next to me on the sofa. And after about 30 seconds, she broke her silence and said, 'Dad, why isn't this TV turning on?' And I said, 'Well, you have to turn it on for it to turn on.' And she said, 'No, it should know I'm here. It should just turn on by itself.'" Now think about this very simple piece of conversation between a father and a daughter. Think about what it represents from a child who is uncorrupted at the moment, at the age of 6, by Googling something. Although my 5-year-old does a brilliant job of talking to Siri, that's a different story. But if you think about what they're expecting from the world around them, the way they want businesses to communicate with them, the way they want access to not only information, but their finances, their health information, their well-being, and everything around them is up for disruption. Because the bar for what this human, the evolution of this human, is continuously asking us to do is to continuously raise it, and not only raise it, continuously evolve it. Now, what does that mean from an industry perspective? Now, think about, we were all getting very used to the idea of, obviously pre-COVID days, just calling an Uber or a Careem or a Lyft or any of these taxis to come pick us up and move us, or even food to come deliver to us and so forth. Now think about the number of industries that converge to make that one transaction happen. So here you are on your mobile, you press pick me up on your Uber or Careem or Lyft. All things happen in the back end. Someone picks you, drops you off, a transaction was made, and off you go. But if you think about how transportation, financial services, healthcare, software, government, the driver ecosystem, employment, so many bureaus, so many chambers, so many governmental, public and private partnerships starting to converge in real time to make that one transaction happen. Now, if you think about what that represents, it represents the evolution of industries itself. So when we talk about the Islamic countries or the world as a whole, we need to start thinking about how the ultimate consumers of these services are required, and what the creators of these services are required to do, and what the governments that regulate them are required to do as well. And that's where the infrastructure that The thinking in human capital alluded to what David suggested from a human capital perspective, thinks in that capacity as well. And then the consumption of this type of information and innovation from a people perspective also have to be upped as well. Because if you create something for a group of people that maybe are not ready for this type of innovation, you're not there yet. So I think from a humanistic perspective, as well as industry perspective, we're in a complete evolution globally. Now, where does that fit in the Islamic world? Let me pull up a slide and let me share this screen with you guys. Bear with me 1 second. Can you guys see this? Perfect. So the idea is we've as we did some research on some of where some of these countries in the ICCIA reside, the results were very interesting. Now, there's a global readiness competitiveness report by the World Economic Forum. It measures your economic prosperity and productivity based on 12 key factors. Now, if you look at these key factors, they're divided up into 4 different groups. The enabling environment, that talks about the institutions and the infrastructure. ICT adoption, ICT is your internet and communications and technology adoption. Your stability of the macroeconomic kind. Then we talk about the human capital with the health and the skills and so forth. And then where your markets are overall, whether it's product or labor or financial, and then the overall size of it and so forth. And then if there's an innovation ecosystem that exists in these countries or not. Now, it was interesting to see that out of the 40 countries, 39 countries or 40 countries, only 4 of them are in the top 40. You've got your Emirates, Malaysia, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia. And the way to sort of decipher this information is, are there any strong links to these 12 factors? Which ones are the weak ones and which ones are behind? Now, these ones somewhat have the financial system that's available or somewhat of an ICT adoption because of phones and so forth. But where they're really, really weak is their business dynamism, the business models, the way they're innovating, and the innovation capability. And the capability comes with across the board, cross-functional thinking between the government, between educational institutions, between your industry, and then more importantly, your innovation institutions, your incubators and others that have to be established around this as well to make that happen. And we looked at another aspect of this as well. We looked at it from a Cisco readiness index as well. Here, again, the strong links were the basic needs and the human capital. There were some on the weak side between business and government investment and so forth. The results are pretty much the same as well. And in this case, your top ICCIA nations, again, you've got the Qatar and the Malaysia and the Oman and so forth. Then we've got some of the lowest ranked ones as well, almost in the 130s and 140s as well. So what that means is not only is it ripe for innovation, but it's also ripe for creating the nice vision to make that happen as well. And this one pretty much enables a lot of this as well. This is readiness for virtual work. This is your speed of broadband that enables this virtual world. And the virtual world doesn't necessarily mean, in this case, a work from home scenario. It also enables a lot of these models of innovation and disruption that start from a mobile phone or start from a home internet piece and so forth. And if you look at it, the highest being Europe in this case at 76.34, the ICCIA average is somewhere in the 23s in the world. That's a big gap in terms of productivity, in terms of the way innovation is enabled using some of these newer techniques and so forth. And lastly, based on this, let's start looking at each of these realms of industries as well. I mean, most of The ICCIA countries are very agri-strong. They're there. I think we need to continue, to David's earlier point, to invest in them as well. But if you look at healthcare, the global healthcare will be at 224 billion by 2023. That's a global estimate. But then if you look at the ICCIA perspective, only 4 members have healthcare transformation plans. Most of them have not sort of looked at healthcare as a priority. And I think given where things are with the COVID situation, I think it's been a great indicator of where things are at, not only from the way healthcare is sort of distributed and disseminated, but also collected, but also communicated, so that better care can be taken around them and so forth. Finance is another indicator. I think after COVID, we all could argue that all of us are scared of moving cash around. I am. I'm sure all of you are. I'm sure many others are as well. So there needs to be a widespread infrastructure level efforts to put financial ecosystems with payments and fintechs out there as well. Interestingly, Jakarta, Kuala Lumpur, Dubai, and Karachi are some of the recognized fintech hubs. Dubai is definitely leading this pack as well, with a lot of the EMEA style innovations as well. But I think the movement of money itself is not an isolated piece. The movement of the financial ecosystem is where a lot of other industries also sit through as well, whether they're healthcare or e-commerce and others as well, which leads us to the e-commerce side of the house as well. I mean, if you look at COVID as an indicator where people are, let's say, confined to their homes for extended period of times, some of the industries that were granted permission to go and consume their business included some of these logistics and e-commerce players. Our humanistic needs for food and everyday, pieces of equipment, small and big, will continue to evolve. So we've seen in the last 90 days a very significant rise in home delivery activity. Some of the forward ones are also experimenting with drones, especially on the global side. But in the ICCIA countries, we're looking at Egypt and Pakistan, in some cases Saudi Arabia and UAE, as more the forward-looking ones, especially with Careem and Uber and Food Pandas and some of the others sort of that are in this space as well. And then lastly, in this case, is the online education and a reform of education as well. And I think this doves into that piece that David alluded to around the overall reforms of education as well. Education in the classroom stemmed from the industrial age, which is where factory workers were sat in front of an assembly line and kind of taught those things as well. And I think education at scale, which is what the youth of these countries definitely and desperately need. You saw the youth numbers that David showed as well. In this case, Malaysia, Indonesia are sort of leading the pack in reskilling the program. But across the board, there needs to be a well thought out plan of what skill necessarily means. Does understanding digital, is that the end all be all? And then what does digital mean? And we'll talk about that in a later part of the program as well. So I think as we close this section of my question, I think some of the things to recap on this is humans are evolving, industries are evolving, industries are converging, and we need a wider understanding of what that really means and internalize that to make better decisions and create the right visions and partnerships to make that happen. I'm going to stop sharing this, and Alia, it's back to you for this one.
Thank you, Javed. So, listening to you and David, I mean, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. There's a lot of opportunity that's coming out of it. And, we've talked about the acceleration that's being caused because of the pandemic that we're, facing, and sort of bringing it all together in my mind and thinking of, because I'm a very action oriented person, right? So I always think that this is the problem and now this is the roadmap and this is what we need to do. So I'd like to spend some time about that as well. And I'm glad that this theme was broken down into 4 different segments, because I realize now that there's just so much that we need to sort of wrap our heads around. So we talked about, we've both David and yourself shared a little bit about the business models that need to evolve, right? As well as the policy, infrastructure, the skill sets. So I'd like your thoughts on what are those business models? How do we sort of, help the private sector of the ICCI member countries to think around the strategy, the business models, if there's some examples that we could share. And towards the end, I would also like the 3 of us to sort of have 3 clear takeaways on what the audience should go back and sort of reflect upon and think in their businesses. So, David, would you like to start with that?
Yeah, I can kick it off. I think when you start to look at new models, I think one of the clearest, at least the most discussed about, I think at the moment, is these sort of new business models. So when we start to look at the combination of social and economics, and whether that's impact investing, blended finance, social enterprises, social innovation, or social entrepreneurs, we're starting to see that really stick in a lot of the mindsets. We're seeing universities now that are putting on social innovation and social entrepreneur programs, curriculum. We're seeing some of the corporates, even some of the major corporates, sort of pushing this new sort of capitalism, if you will, sustainable capitalism. A lot of the World Economic Forum is talking about this, on what that means, sort of the new green economy, or the new green deals we see in Europe, or the one proposed in North America, for example. So we're starting to see a lot of shifts in the blend in that. So I think that's going to be one of the main factors. And it's being driven by investors on one side and by consumers on the other side. And we were discussing this a little bit earlier. Corporates are sort of in the middle. A lot of pressure is being put on corporates to make these decisions, where they're not really the decision makers when you start to look at that whole value chain. Where are they getting their money from? Well, they get their money from investors, shareholders, if they're that large, or through private investment, venture capitalists. And if investors are going to start demanding more socially conscious investments, if they're going to invest in business, or they're going to invest in green, if they're going to invest in blue, like the SDGs, if they're going to invest in this, that's going to actually put pressure and help the companies sort of figure out which direction. The same thing with the consumers. Companies get their money from consumers who buy products and services. So as more and more the mind shift from consumers towards friendlier products and services, whether it's environmentally friendly, socially friendly, governance friendly, anti-corruption, anti-slavery, inequalities, these types of, once that mind shift starts to go, then we're going to see business change, because business simply reacts in that sense. So I think putting all the pressure on business is sort of unfair. It's really being driven from where they're getting their money from. And that's sort of the target I'm going at. Now, where does government come in as that sort of third sector, the public sector? They can actually create the enable environment, incentives for going green, incentives for creating efficiencies, incentives for hiring, social talent, or focusing. This is sort of the new CSR, corporate social responsibility. Not simply just giving money to museums or doing some of the work that they're doing before, but reinvesting that money into their own businesses to become more socially conscious. So I think I'll just off the top, I'll hand over to Javi. But I think right off the top, I think that's just one of the areas where we're seeing this sort of shift.
So here's I'll answer that. When people break down business models, a lot of times they also complicate it, right? What's a business model in essence? It's potentially solving a challenge by the use of some tactic, right? Now, if you break it down to, the basics of it as well, uh, the challenges in most of the ICCIA countries are different than the West, right? Like my mother aptly puts, let's not find English solutions to Urdu problems, which I think is quite funny. But if you look at the, sort of the the overall physicality of that, it makes sense, because where you are in terms of the people, their understanding of things is not going to change overnight. Their way of communicating, the way of buying is not going to change overnight. So I think what we need to sort of focus in these countries especially is we need to figure out the real challenges, and then we need to figure out how innovative technology solutions that either have already been built across the board, or there is a cultural sort of a flavor of that's actually brought to their part of the world. How can those two, as well as a humanistic learning skill set, which needs to be sort of advanced anyways, how can the three of these combine to come up with an innovative solution that works for that part of the world, right? So if we're sitting in Afghanistan, and there's a certain challenge that requires a certain way of thinking, a certain way of communicating, a certain way of invoicing, a certain way of delivery, a certain way of movement of money and so forth, you're sort of relying on what's available in the various aspects or areas, industries, to solve that. I'll give you an example of that. Now that I spent a lot of time in Pakistan as well, with these regions, I wanted to pay a bill last year for this club, and I called the person. I said, "Is there a way of doing this digitally?" And the clerk at the reception, he said, "You know what? Yes, there is a digital way of doing it." Sorry, I'll rephrase my question. I said, "Is there a way of doing this digitally where I don't have to go to a bank and transfer you the money?" And his response, interestingly, was, "After you've paid the money at the bank, this is what you did," which was funny in a way. But then I thought a lot about how he answered. His real answer was, once you've paid the money, you can take a picture of the receipt and WhatsApp it to me with your account number, and then I'll update it on my end. Now, first I thought it was the overall fail of the piece, but then I thought that, this person has figured out, or this organization has figured out, how to digitize their piece. The banks have not figured out how to digitize their piece for them, right? It's a collective of me, this group, as well as the bank, to sort of solve that problem. So I think as we start looking at, solutions, we need to localize them or regionalize them in essence as well, and figure out regional ways of responding to them with obviously all the new and innovative technologies. And in many cases, sometimes the new and innovation technologies not only solve the problem, it solves the next problem for you as well, right? In Africa, they did not have phone infrastructure for decades. But when the cell phone came through, all you needed was a cell phone tower, and boom, the next 50 miles, you're good, right? So we need to start thinking and bringing in all the innovations of the West, and then come up with a sliver of localization to solve them. And that's going to create those new and innovative business models that will not only scale, but people will be able to adapt them as well.
Well answered. I have a question right now that I would like to share with you. Looking at the aspect of the ICCIA member states' readiness for virtual work, I don't see African countries except for Egypt. Does this mean they are that far away from the rest of the world? Or is it just the lack of data and information about where they stand?
So it's interesting. We'll share the link of an article, Transformix, my company, we just published last month. It was around the readiness of work from home, and it was from an employer's perspective, as well as the separate one was from an employee's perspective. And where we sort of broke that down into was, what does readiness from on work from home really mean, right? Now, readiness in this case has many challenges. There is a technological readiness, first of all, which I talked about, how you need certain types of bandwidth, certain broadband to sort of enable that. Without that, first of all, there is no work from home situation. Secondly, you need access to those machines and peripherals. So a machine with a camera, something with a headphone and so forth. So there's an infrastructure aspect to it. There's a technological aspect to it. Then there's a software aspect to it. You need one of these Zoom or Microsoft Teams or a Google Hangout or many others. There are many other we listed as well. Vonage is another one that we're partners, global partners with, that does this as well. There's so many that are out there as well. So the infrastructure, the hardware, the software is the basis of the entire thing. But I think where the work from home models typically fail is from a policy perspective. What does it mean? What percentage of the groups that work for you can work from home? What industries are more prone to work from home? Interestingly, as we were digging this, we put this in the article as well. But one of the things we talked about was that work from home is not a new thing. It's been around for decades. If you think about not only decades, but centuries, the hunter-gatherers, right? The farmers, they've always lived and grown things right there as well, right? Even modern day shopkeepers, many times they're living either at the front on a shop and then working at the front and living at the back, or working at the bottom and living on top, right? So the amalgamation of work from home in this newest sense is definitely new. But what I was just, sort of in a conversation with a global thought leader last week, I was talking about how, give you an example of the US, that 33% of the jobs are easy. They can easily go from work from home. There's a good 2/3 of the jobs that either require a certain set of protocols, because you cannot take those big machines home, right? So a policy that clearly delineates between the type of work that can be done from home and enablement of those types of infrastructure and hardware software can be done. And then a policy around making the rest of them successful in terms of giving them as best automated means as possible, with an understanding that a complete work from home in that case won't be possible. So it's a hybrid model. And there's an employer perspective on this, on what the employer needs to provide or a manager needs to do. Obviously, there's burnout, there's other things like that as well in there. And then there's an employee perspective. When we're working from home, obviously there are psychological issues, isolation. There's so many other factors involved as well. And we'll share that with the articles they'll spell out. But I think El Sadiq, that's the first part. Obviously, there are future aspects or more advanced aspects from working from home. But I think these are the beginning pieces that you guys can start dabbling with, and you guys can do more on that. Hope that answers the question.
So we have another question. Which role can the governments play in encouraging and nourishing the virtual world nowadays?
Well, let's ask the UN guy first.
Yeah. I'll take that one first then. I mean, governments are actually playing a very active role. I mean, in Thailand, where I live, you see Thailand 4.0. You see Canada 4.0, EU 4.0. Singapore certainly is moving in this direction. Korea is moving in this direction. And it's all driven by the government. So they're sort of taking the Industrial Revolution 4.0 and saying, okay, now how do we take the different parts of the Industrial Revolution and sort of bring it into, so how do we make sure that our economy survives going forward? And this is the responsibility of governments to really sort of push that. And they do that by different ways. So they either bring in policy incentive, financial incentives for investment, education incentives to sort of change curriculum towards more of the new skills that are required. And even some of the corporate models in that sense, government are leading. You look at Singapore, for example, is a good example. Switzerland's another good example. Malaysia is also actually a very good example. They've done a lot in Malaysia as far as e-government, digitalizing their government services. Bangladesh has got the A2I program, which is an incredible program, supported all the way to the top from the Prime Minister's office. And it is putting education and health clinics way out, and internet access way out into the rural, right down to the last mile. A very successful program in Bangladesh. So there is a lot of government sponsoring that comes in. And I think that's where it actually has to begin, because the private sector manages risk. It understands risk, but risk is a cost to the private sector. Where public sector, it's not necessarily a cost to the public sector. They do have to pay for risk, but that funding comes in through the sale of natural resources or through taxes or this. So they do actually have the budgets to manage risk better than. So I think, again, it comes down to PPP, private and public partnerships, working together, the private sector and the public sector, with engagement with the civic sector. But there's a lot of great examples out there. And even now you see it in Africa. Just go back to the previous question. You see actually now in Africa a lot of movement towards the governments really stepping in to sort of open the doors for entrepreneurs, create the enabling environment for innovation, technology transfer, IP protection, so innovation does actually get protected. So you do see a lot of movement. So depending on which government or which country you actually work in or live in, I think it's just a matter of sort of looking around, but I think a lot of governments are moving in this direction.
Great, thank you for that. Another challenge which I've also sort of experienced or observed myself is the challenge of being able to communicate all the incentives that are out there. Or earlier, David, when you and I were discussing about the financing of all these digital transformations that's required or the private sector would like to do, unfortunately, it's not that the communication is not that readily available outside of the development sector. So any advice on how that can be improved? Or how that can be given attention so that it's reached out to other than the development sector actors?
I mean, I'll touch on that briefly. Javid probably has a lot more information on this, but as a scare tactic, the European Union has 27,000 programs that they offer. It's mind-boggling, absolutely mind-boggling. And it has created a whole industry of consultants simply trying to understand what fits where. It is mind-boggling. So the only thing I would say when we start to look at that, and again, and then the opposite side, look at the development sector. The UN has 32 agencies and multiple, and they're stepping on each other's toes. I mean, simplicity is the way to move it forward. And I think this is important if it's coming from the government side or if it's coming from the development sector side. Simplicity is the way to move it forward. And both sectors have something to learn. And I experienced that directly when I was working with UNDP. The development sector has to understand that it lives within a marketplace. The development sector is not creating the jobs. It's private sector that are creating jobs. The development sector is not creating innovation. It's the private sector that's creating the innovation. And the private sector is moving very quickly into the global development sector and starting to take control. So they have to understand how do you turn a project to make it much more sustainable over the time. That means it needs a bit of a business model. And business model doesn't mean it has to be commercial or for profit. It could be a nonprofit, but it needs a business model. A lot of NGOs now are moving into a hybrid phase where they're offering their services for free, but they're also charging for some services to maintain some sense of sustainability so they can actually live longer and supply impact much longer. Same thing with private sector. Nothing wrong with profit. Profit is simply an indication of your acceptance of a product or service by consumers. Nothing wrong with profit. Greedy profit, toxic profit, there's some issues with that. So they have to understand that their products and services go through incredibly long value chains, whether it's on the supply side or raw material side, whether it's on the delivery side, and even within their house, how they manufacture. And there's a lot of opportunity to open up your manufacturing floors to wheelchairs, for example, to people who are blind or deaf. There's a lot of opportunities to give, an enabling environment for disadvantaged or minorities to get involved and become engaged in that sense. So they have a lot to learn from the development sector. And slowly by slowly, they're starting to come together and sort of, they still speak different languages. And that's a tough one. But slowly by slowly, with the United Nations and the World Economic Forum starting to collaborate on certain things, certainly you got experts like Javed and others who cross these boundaries a lot, that move within the development sector and move within the private sector and also the public sector. That's helping to sort of generate and connect a lot of the three sectors so they're not so hard siloed. Those silos are starting to break down. And I think that's just what has to happen. It's the only way that we're going to move forward, if we all start speaking the same language and sort of come up with some common goals. Otherwise, the sectors tend to compete. And to the industrial stage, that may have been valuable or at least neutral, but it's having a negative impact as we look forward.
Thanks. Javed, would you like to add to that?
No, I think it was very well captured. I think you're right. The opportunity is massive, and unless all these work together towards a common goal, it's definitely not going to happen. And I'll share an example. We did this program when I was at Salesforce for the Obama administration back in the day, where the idea was to disseminate the right information to the right constituents at the right time, whether it was election polling and so forth. And the command center that was sort of responsible for not only gathering it, but also crafting it in certain ways, had the big onus. But then it's also the distribution of this information that is also has to be done in certain creative ways as well. And we're doing the same thing. We're global partners, like I said earlier, with a company called Vonage, where we sort of take a lot of these messaging and put it on videos and voice and SMS and WhatsApp and others across the phones for many cross-country companies, cross-country agencies, and so forth. So all of those things have certain advantages, but then all sides have to understand each other in terms of what they're trying to do, what they're trying to create, and then what they're trying to communicate to the constituents. And I think all of them, have their own unique challenges, none that cannot be solved.
Thank you, Javed, for that. If there are any other questions? So I think
I've got a question.
Oh, okay, sure.
Okay.
I've got a question. I got a question for Javed, actually.
Oh, wow.
I mean, I was going to say, when I was doing my presentation, I mentioned that I'm an accidental hybrid because I just got luckier. I had the opportunity to cut across sectors and cut across geographies and everything else. But what do you think? I mean, what are you seeing going forward? There's very few universities that are cross-faculty, for example. My experience with ministries is that ministries tend to fight with each other over budget, and the way that the governments are structured. I mean, you've got the Ministry of Health, Education over here, but then you got the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of National Development over there, and they're not speaking to each other. Are you seeing any evidence that, for example, in Malaysia or some of the countries that are succeeding, that is one of the hurdles that they've overcome? And that is maybe one of the drivers of some of the rankings to be moved up if some of these silos start getting broken down. I mean, you work in development, you work in private sector, you work with public, I'm the same, but many don't have that opportunity. But are you seeing evidence that may be one of the drivers of some of the rankings that you mentioned earlier?
So I think I'll answer it this way. The one thing that I'm seeing, again, human psyche, creating fiefdoms within fiefdoms, that's human nature. That's always been there and will continue to be there. What I'm seeing is now that more and more technology is being used across silos to sort of manage all of this, a lot of them are having a challenge creating those technology specific fiefdoms across the board, because in many cases they either don't understand it, or in many cases it's out of their control. And many of them I'm seeing are against rapid digitization and automation in many countries, especially in the developing world, because it also brings a lot of transparency, right? If you start to automate processes, guess what? You're eliminating some of the people and what they sat on. I mean, if these governmental organizations had their own ways, they will sit on a file or an approval for months and not do it. But when there are silos coming at you in a more digitized and transparent way, where not only you but your boss can see that there are all these queries are coming, it's definitely breaking down those silos. So I think, not a direct answer to your question, but there's an uneasiness of what this digital thing will do in terms of exposing a lot of these fiefdoms. And I think that's because of that angst, they're acting a certain way. I saw that in North America as well. I mean, you know, we talk about all these different countries and corruption. Oh my God, there's some of these cities in the US. And across the board, I think as we look at how, when I talked about these organizational and divisional as well as industrial things converging, I think you'll see these fiefdoms going away, but new ones evolving. And a lot of them are going to be, and this may be a little more advanced to this audience, but a lot of them might have algorithmic biases in them as well, right? So if I don't like a certain behavior, I don't have to put that in policy. I can put that in an algorithm. I can put my bias in there. So I think from a basic perspective, it's not going to go away just by, it might take a different form. I think that would be my answer. And we can have a sidebar on this. Seems like we should.
Well, thank you for that, Javed. You know, now that you suggest and mention this algorithm being sort of manipulated to, you know, build in the biases, it's kind of steady. And I think this is a conversation for another topic and a whole webinar on security of personal information, as well as, you know, the information of the organizations and stuff like this. If there are no other questions, I think we are running close to we have 5 more minutes to go. So I would like to take this time to firstly thank you, David, thank you, Javed, for taking out the time and sharing your knowledge, your experience, your wisdom with us for the participants. Thank you, participants, for joining us today. I hope that you found the webinar useful and something that will add value to your business planning going forward. This was our first session, so please excuse, you know, anything that went wrong. We hope and plan to build on this so that we can bring things that will add more value to your work, to your lives within the Islamic member countries. And most importantly, what I would, and especially taking from Javed's index that you shared with us, you know, for me, I'm viewing that as an opportunity where partnerships can sort of take place cross borders, where we have countries where there is nothing and there's a humongous opportunity, and then others who are already sort of doing extremely well. And I think I came across one of these indexes myself, which kind of made that, you know, some of the countries where the technology momentum is kind of slowing down, they need new territories for partnerships to be able to continue the momentum of their technological sort of advances. So hoping to sort of tap into those and making those connections on the leadership talks. If there are any questions or any future topics that you would like to hear from us, please feel free to connect on our LinkedIn page, or you could email us at iccia.com. We will also be emailing all the presentations which were shared today, as well as the speakers' contact details if you would like to connect with them at a future date for your organization's work. Lastly, I would like to remind you that we have a follow-up session where we will be taking, the conversation that we had today, picking up from here and talking about the opportunities in depth, the challenges that we have to overcome to sort of, tap into those opportunities, as well as the best practices from the OIC countries, which can be implemented and that we can all learn from. On that note, thank you once again, and that's it.
Thank you for having us, Alia. Well done.
Thank you.
Thank you very much on your initiated endeavors there.
And good luck for the next one.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. See you all.
Bye.
Bye now.
All right.